I caught her again this morning, zooming her jet ski past my dock like she owned the lake. Spray hitting my deck, my kayak, my brand new floating pier, everything I built with my own hands. And she wasn't subtle. She waved at me, grinning like she had zero consequences. What they didn't know was I had the original Shoreline survey from 1924 tucked in my office drawer. The same survey that proves my dock is technically the only legal passage for watercraft in this cove. I'm not some weekend warrior. I've spent years fighting for my property rights, navigating zoning codes, and defending this lakefront that I inherited from my parents. And now, watching her break the law while the HOA turns a blind eye. I knew patience had to run its course. Today, I made a decision. The buoys would go up, and the route redirected straight to her shoreline. She had no idea the tide was about to turn. But before that, there was evidence to gather, and the first call that would change everything. I've spent more years studying property lines and maritime ordinances than most people spend on their morning coffee. This lakefront isn't just a view or a weekend escape. It's my life, my investment, and the result of decades of careful planning. When I purchased the property, I didn't just buy land. I bought the responsibility of keeping it safe, private, and functional. Every plank on my dock, every bolt in the pier, every carefully plotted buoy placement came from my own hands or meticulous research. I know every inch of this shoreline, the currents, the hidden sandbars, and the legal boundaries that most neighbors couldn't even point to on a map. I take pride in that. I know the law, and I know my rights. Yet here I was, watching her, Karen, with her perpetual smirk and a jet ski engine that could wake the dead. Every morning, without fail, she'd roar past my dock, spray soaking my deck and my kayak, her laughter slicing through the quiet mist like a blade. I tried patience. I waved politely. I called the HOA. Nothing changed. The community whispered behind closed doors, shaking their heads but doing nothing. The feeling of helplessness gnawed at me, the betrayal of neighbors and HOA officials who refused to intervene, twisting my stomach into knots. This wasn't just inconvenience. It was trespass, damage, and disrespect. And yet, every time she sped past, I reminded myself that I wasn't powerless. I had the surveys, the deeds, the original shoreline maps tucked in my office drawer, knowledge that the HOA either ignored or didn't understand, and certainly that she never bothered to check. The scales weren't even. They had no idea how many tools I had quietly amassed while they flaunted ignorance. That morning, after yet another spray-drenched dock encounter, I found the first official violation notice tucked under my door. Alongside it were community complaint logs, old emails, and notes that confirmed exactly how long the HOA had allowed her to operate unchecked. As I held them, the weight of frustration shifted into clarity. This wasn't just a nuisance anymore. It was a battle, and I had already been arming myself for it in plain sight. The lake was mine, the law was mine, and the next move would change everything. I didn't grow up dreaming about lake houses or docks stretching into open water. I grew up watching my parents scrape, save, and rebuild after every setback, learning early that security comes from paperwork as much as sweat. I carried that lesson into adulthood through a career in land management consulting that taught me how fragile ownership can be when lines blur and rules get ignored. I spent years walking muddy boundaries, translating dense zoning language for confused families, and watching small disputes turn ugly because nobody bothered to read the fine print. By the time I was ready to buy my own place, I wasn't chasing luxury. I was chasing certainty. The lakefront property came onto the market quietly, one grainy listing photo, and a legal description longer than the sales pitch. I drove out before sunrise, tires crunching gravel, fog hanging low enough to taste. The water looked like polished steel, and the shoreline curved inward, sheltered from wind and traffic. Something in that stillness hooked me immediately. I didn't imagine parties or jet skis. I imagined mornings with coffee on a dock I built myself, evenings where the loudest sound was wind moving through reeds. It took nearly every dollar I had saved, plus a careful loan and months of inspections, surveys, and title searches. When I signed the papers, my hands were shaking, not from excitement, but from the weight of what I was protecting. I poured myself into the place after that. I reinforced the seawall, replaced rotten boards, and designed a floating pier that would survive seasonal water shifts without damaging the shoreline. I learned how the sun tracked across the cove, how geese favored the northern reeds, how turtles surfaced near the old stump line every afternoon. Some mornings I'd wake before my alarm just to watch mist rise off the surface, the air cold and metallic in my lungs, birds calling in slow echoes that bounced between tree lines. At night, the water slapped gently against the pilings, while insects hummed so loud it felt like electricity in the dark. Those moments weren't decorative to me. They were proof that the investment was paying back in peace. Financially, it was everything I had. Emotionally, it was even more. This property wasn't a toy. It was the anchor for my future plans, the base for consulting work I ran from home, the quiet I needed after years of standing in courtrooms and county offices arguing over fence posts and drainage ditches. I hosted small gatherings for neighbors, grilled fish on the deck, listened to stories about storms that used to flood the old shoreline before the retaining walls went in. I tried to be the kind of owner people trusted, the one who fixed problems before they turned into lawsuits. There was a rhythm to life there that felt earned. I kept binoculars by the back door for bald eagles that sometimes circled overhead. I learned which boards creaked when the temperature dropped and which dock cleats loosened after heavy rain. Even maintenance felt sacred, the scrape of a brush against algae, the smell of treated wood drying in the sun, my boots thudding hollow over planks I'd measured twice before installing. Every improvement was logged, photographed, filed. That habit wasn't paranoia, it was training. I didn't know then that all of it would become evident someday. At the time, I just believed I was building something permanent, something orderly in a world that loved shortcuts. I thought the lake. Karen showed up in the neighborhood like a storm in a calm sky. Impossible to ignore, impossible to reason with. From the moment she moved into the house 2 lots down, she carried herself with that exact brand of entitlement that makes property owners nervous. A sharp smile, perfectly styled hair, and an aura that whispered, "Rules don't apply to me." She was the kind of person who corrected your mailbox alignment while you were out measuring it, or commented on your landscaping, as if she were the self-appointed arbiter of taste. Behind the polished veneer, there was a controlling streak so pronounced that it bordered on obsessive. She liked to know where everyone was, what everyone was doing, and how it might affect her. Every minor decision about the lake, docks, boats, buoys, was her business, whether it concerned her or not. It started small. The first time her jet ski roared past my dock, I waved politely, hoping to signal boundaries without confrontation. The spray soaked my deck, but I let it go. Karen didn't even look my way. She didn't acknowledge that her wake had destroyed half my morning coffee ritual. Later, I left a note tucked under her door. "Please respect private docks and shoreline property." The reply was predictable. Nothing, and then came the HOA. When I reported her trespassing and minor damages, hoping for a straightforward resolution, I quickly learned that Karen had already cultivated allies. She knew how to phrase complaints, exaggerate minor grievances, and twist HOA meetings in her favor. Board members seemed hesitant to confront her, intimidated by her confidence, or maybe enjoying the drama she stirred. I realized the rules only mattered if she said they did, and any objection I raised was met with half-hearted attention or outright dismissal. Her smugness was perfectly captured one morning after yet another pass past my dock, spraying water over my kayak and deck. She waved at me, tilting her head with that knowing grin. "I can do whatever I want here," she called, voice carrying over the lake. "It's a public lake." The words hit like a slap, part entitlement, part challenge, part defiance. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. I had other tools, and patience had its own kind of power. Every wave that sloshed against my dock reminded me just how fragile this place could be. A single rogue jet ski slicing past at full speed could send planks flying, loosen cleats, or knock a kayak into splinters. Over time, repeated wakes began eroding the shoreline, washing away sand and soil I had painstakingly stabilized with retaining walls. Even minor property damage wasn't just cosmetic. It threatened years of investment, labor, and careful planning. A broken pier board or a shifted buoy could ripple into much larger problems, creating safety hazards not just for me, but for anyone using the dock. I imagined a child stumbling over a wet plank, a fishing line tangling with a jet ski, the kind of accident that could become a legal nightmare. The risk was constant, and every day Karen sped past was a reminder that I couldn't rely on goodwill or polite warnings. It wasn't just the physical damage that weighed on me. My legacy in this neighborhood, the respect I had earned quietly over years of careful stewardship, was slipping under the tide of repeated harassment. I had hoped to be seen as a responsible, thoughtful property owner, someone who valued community and maintained the lake for everyone's benefit. Instead, Karen's antics made me look powerless to my neighbors, undermining credibility I had spent a decade building. Every sideways glance, whispered comment at HOA meetings, every question about why nothing was done, chipped at the sense of stability I had worked so hard to maintain. Reputation, once fractured, is far harder to repair than a dock, and I could feel it slipping with each wave that crashed over my carefully maintained pier. The tension wasn't contained to me alone. I could feel the neighborhood itself dividing, some quietly siding with Karen, drawn to her boldness or intimidated by her theatrics. Others were afraid to intervene, worried that taking a stand might draw her ire or cause more trouble than it was worth. I became painfully aware that what started as personal harassment had grown into a communal problem, trust eroding alongside the sand beneath the shoreline. Every morning, I woke to the sound of engines and laughter, wondering which neighbor might finally step forward, or whether I'd have to fight this battle entirely on my own. Emotionally, it was exhausting. Frustration festered into anger into a slow, burning resentment that shadowed every peaceful moment I had once cherished. The quiet mornings on the deck, the mist rising from the water, the hum of birds in the reeds, all of it became tinged with a sense of intrusion, a constant reminder that control over my property, my sanctuary, was no longer mine alone. Every violation, no matter how small, carried a weight far beyond its physical impact. It was a challenge to my authority, my investment, and my belief that property could be respected when it was clearly worth protecting. I realized then that this fight wasn't optional. If I didn't act, the damage would continue, both to the land and to my standing in the community. Every spray from her jet ski was a call to attention, a signal that the rules and boundaries I relied on were meaningless unless I enforced them. The stakes were no longer abstract. They were real, immediate, and growing by the day. Protecting the property meant more than preserving a dock or a shoreline. It meant defending my reputation, my safety, and the legacy I intended to leave behind. The first fine arrived in the mail on a crisp Thursday morning, a single sheet of typed paper with the HOA letterhead stamped across the top. I read it twice, thinking I had misinterpreted the language. The claim, my dock encroached slightly beyond approved boundaries. I had measured and remeasured every board before installing it. I had photographs, survey maps, and signed permits from county authorities. Yet here it was, a $250 fine, couched in bureaucratic language designed to make compliance feel urgent. I called the HOA office, my tone calm but firm, asking for clarification. The receptionist muttered something about board discretion and hung up. That was the beginning. Fines began to pile up with alarming regularity. One week, the angle of a cleat was not compliant. Another, the spacing between boards supposedly violated aesthetic guidelines. Each notice was meticulously crafted to seem official, but the pattern was obvious. These were harassment tools, not enforcement. I documented every detail, photographing the dock, noting dates, keeping every envelope. Knowledge was my weapon, because I knew that their claims were baseless. Yet even with proof in hand, the mental weight was crushing. It felt like a slow erosion of authority, each fine a reminder that the HOA, the people entrusted to maintain fairness, had aligned itself against me. Then came the surveillance. At first, it was subtle. A drone hovering over the water, a camera pointed too strategically from a neighboring property, shadows glimpsed from upstairs windows. I had seen enough of this in my consulting work to know it wasn't coincidence. Someone was keeping close tabs on my daily routine, launch times, morning coffee habits, even which side of the dock I preferred for fishing. It was invasive, unsettling. I never confronted the drone directly. Instead, I documented, noting serial numbers, angles, and times. Each entry became part of a larger mosaic I intended to leverage later, a counterweight to the harassment that was otherwise invisible to neighbors and the HOA board. The HOA itself became a channel for manipulation. Slanderous emails circulated to neighbors, claiming my dock blocked public access or that I was conducting illegal commercial activities from my property. One email, sent anonymously but obviously tied to HOA leadership, accused me of creating safety hazards with improperly installed buoys. Another claimed my property devalued the neighborhood with unauthorized landscaping. I knew these statements were lies, but the effect was palpable. Murmurs during HOA meetings, cold shoulders during community events, and suspicion from neighbors who had never questioned me before. Karen's presence was the catalyst, but the HOA's inaction, or worse, tacit complicity, amplified the intimidation. Every day became a delicate balance. I could no longer enjoy the lake without scanning the horizon for her jet ski or wondering who else was watching. I spent hours countering false accusations, sending formal letters, and documenting every interaction. Even mundane tasks like removing algae from the pier or tightening a railing felt weighted with the possibility that someone would twist it into another violation. I learned to keep my movements methodical, my records exhaustive, and my patience intact, knowing that any slip could be used against me. The harassment wasn't just practical, it was psychological. Each notice, each surveillance sighting, each whispered rumor reinforced the narrative the HOA wanted, that I was a troublemaker, an outsider trying to bend rules for my own convenience. The isolation gnawed at me, not because I doubted my rights, but because the community I had once trusted now seemed like an audience for my humiliation. Even friends who had lived nearby for years hesitated to speak up, wary of drawing Karen's attention or the HOA's ire. Yet in the midst of this, I noticed patterns. Every false fine was based on obscure wording. Every drone pass coincided with Karen's loudest appearances on the lake. The emails and rumors always referenced technicalities most people wouldn't know, like minute changes in water levels or slight deviations from the original survey. It was methodical, intentional, and predictable, and in predictability, I saw leverage. Each abuse, each sly manipulation, was leaving a trail. The documentation I had maintained, the photographs, the maps, the emails, the recorded HOA communications, was no longer just for my own defense. It was the foundation for a strategy that could finally turn the tables. I began to realize that Karen's arrogance, combined with the HOA's negligence, was exactly what I needed. They believed I was powerless. They believed my frustration and isolation would break me. They were wrong. Each fake fine and invasive observation was evidence, a breadcrumb trail showing how rules could be twisted to serve their interests. I kept every notice, every email, every photograph. I cataloged dates, times, and witnesses. By the end of that summer, I had a meticulous record of harassment, a timeline that proved intent, coordination, and abuse of authority. And yet, despite all of this, Karen never slowed. Every morning, the engine roared across the lake. Every weekend, her friends joined her, laughing, splashing, unconcerned with boundaries or legality. I watched it all from the dock, anger simmering but not boiling. I refused to react impulsively. Instead, I mapped every movement, cross-referenced it with my legal knowledge, and planned the moment when patience would finally meet preparation. The day the buoys went up, the scale of justice would finally shift, and every ounce of surveillance, every false fine, every email would serve to prove that her behavior wasn't just reckless, it was actionable. The nights became the hardest. I would lie awake on the second-floor bedroom, the smell of lake mist drifting through the open windows, and hear the faint growl of a jet ski engine far across the water. It was subtle at first, just enough to stir unease, but over time it became a constant rhythm in the background of my life. I could tell without looking when Karen or her friends were out on the lake, the precise cadence of the motor, the slapping of water against hulls, the distant laughter that carried over the cove. Sleep was fractured. Every time I dozed, I imagined a wake crashing into the dock or a neighbor watching, shaking their head, whispering that I was overreacting. Isolation set in like a fog that no amount of sunshine could dissipate. Neighbors who once greeted me with nods or brief hellos began to avoid eye contact. In the grocery store, whispers seemed to follow me. Questions about the trouble at the lake, comments about my strict rules or obsessive property habits. Some of it was subtle, some blatant. Casual remarks in front of others, knowing glances during community barbecues. Karen, of course, thrived on the attention, waving to the crowd with a grin that said she had successfully turned my life into a spectacle. The HOA meetings were worse. Each session became a theater of judgment, with Karen's allies and the board members murmuring side comments as if I were the problem rather than the victim of repeated trespass and harassment. The embarrassment stung in a way that was more corrosive than the damage to the dock itself. Frustration began to simmer under the surface like a slow-burning ember. Every fine, every drone overhead, every whispered rumor added fuel. I clenched my jaw during breakfast when I spotted fresh footprints along the shoreline that didn't belong to me, proof someone had trespassed in the night. I paced the deck, feeling the rough grain of weathered planks beneath my boots, listening to the wind through the reeds, trying to think clearly instead of letting anger dictate my response. Each roar of a jet ski past my dock was a reminder that control, my control, had been chipped away bit by bit. I wanted to lash out, to yell, to confront every neighbor who looked at me suspiciously, but I knew that reaction would play directly into Karen's hands. I had to hold myself in check, even while resentment tightened like a steel band around my chest. The lake itself, once a place of solace, became an arena of tension. Misty mornings that used to feel sacred were now punctuated by engines slicing through the fog. The smell of damp earth, usually grounding and comforting, felt heavy with unease. My kayak, once an extension of peaceful solitude, sat tethered to the dock, unused, as I watched Karen and her entourage carve paths across the water with careless abandon. Even the birds seemed to react, startled into flight by sudden splashes and mechanical hums, leaving the reeds eerily quiet in their absence. I began documenting everything obsessively, every pass of a jet ski, every noise in the dead of night, every suspicious shadow along the shoreline. The frustration transformed into methodical observation, but observation is exhausting in its own way. Each hour of vigilance stole sleep. Each recording and note-taking session reminded me that the harassment wasn't just random, it was orchestrated. The sense of being watched, judged, and belittled gnawed at the edges of my focus, leaving a residue of tension that followed me from sunrise to well past sunset. Neighbors' gossip was the final weight. During weekend visits, casual remarks were carefully measured but cutting. "Did you hear about the dock incident?" Or, "They say you're fine was justified." It wasn't the words themselves that hurt. It was the implication that the community had already assumed my guilt, that Karen's version of events had been accepted as fact. Even friends who had tried to offer support seemed hesitant, unsure of where to stand, and afraid of becoming collateral in Karen's quiet campaign of intimidation. I felt exposed, watched, and alone in a place that had once been my sanctuary. Yet through the sleepless nights and constant tension, something else began to grow. A quiet, simmering determination. Anger sharpened my focus. Isolation forced me to analyze every detail, to anticipate every possible move. Every jet ski cutting through the morning calm reminded me what was at stake. And every whisper of gossip reinforced that this wasn't just about property. It was about control, respect, and the boundaries that Karen had no right to cross. The lake had become a classroom in patience, strategy, and endurance. I knew that the buildup of frustration was not the end. It was the prelude to something larger. Every fine, every drone, every whispered accusation was leaving a trail, and every sleepless night was preparing me for the moment when all of it could be turned to my advantage. By the time I decided to take matters into my own hands, I knew I couldn't rely on anger alone. I had to understand every rule, every loophole, every technicality that could protect my property, and potentially turn the tables on Karen and the HOA. That meant revisiting everything I thought I knew about waterfront law and zoning codes, and digging deeper into the kind of regulations most homeowners ignore. The first revelation came at the county zoning office. I spent hours shuffling through dusty map drawers and filing cabinets, scanning microfilm reels of old surveys and ordinances. The smell of aged paper mixed with a faint mildew tang, a sensory reminder of just how long these rules had been in place. I learned that private docks like mine weren't just decoration. They were legally protected structures, provided they followed specific setbacks and height restrictions. The lake was technically a public waterway, yes, but public didn't mean unregulated access past every dock. Navigation rights existed, but they did not give every watercraft the ability to cut recklessly across private property. That distinction, buried in Municipal Code 14.2.3, was crucial. It meant that someone like Karen, roaring past my dock at full throttle, wasn't just rude. She was skirting legal boundaries, violating rules designed to protect both safety and property rights. Next came a deeper dive into the HOA's authority, or lack thereof. Their powers, I discovered, were far more limited than I had assumed. HOA boards could enforce covenants and collect dues, but they could not override pre-existing property deeds or municipal law. I pored over my deed, comparing it to HOA bylaws and local ordinances. The pages smelled faintly of ink and old wood polish as I traced the survey boundaries, noting exactly where my property ended and the lake began. The HOA could fine me for aesthetic violations, for non-compliance with vague community rules, but they could not grant Karen the right to violate the lakefront's legal boundaries. In other words, every claim the board had made on her behalf, or ignored on my behalf, was vulnerable to challenge if I could document it thoroughly. Finally, I focused on waterway navigation rights and trespassing law. There were nuances I had never considered: speed limits within certain distances of private docks, wake restrictions, and liability for property damage caused by reckless passage. Most homeowners never read these clauses, assuming the lake was free for all. But in reality, federal and state statutes protect private dock owners against harassment and property damage from watercraft. If documented correctly, violations could result in fines, restrictions, or even orders requiring removal of boats from protected paths. I sketched diagrams in my notebook, measuring angles, distances, and current flow, noting exactly where each violation occurred, and photographing each section of shoreline for evidence. Each nugget reinforced a growing realization: Karen's behavior wasn't just annoying, it was legally actionable. Her repeated trespassing, compounded by the HOA's inaction, left her vulnerable. I spent hours cross-referencing microfilm surveys from decades ago with modern GPS measurements, photographing original markers, and noting discrepancies. Every technical detail, every obscure clause in zoning or waterway law became ammunition in a strategy I had been building quietly for months. And then I found it. A loophole. Buried deep in the original 1924 Shoreline survey was a clause that no one in the HOA had ever mentioned. It detailed precise navigation paths that watercraft were legally allowed to take past private docks. My dock was fully compliant. Karen's route, however, cut directly across a section marked as restricted for private property protection. The paperwork was clear. Her daily passes weren't just reckless, they violated a law that could trigger fines and even force removal of her boats from the protected area. My pulse quickened as I held the faded, fragile documents in my hands. Everything I had prepared, the fines, the surveillance logs, the emails, was about to converge into leverage I hadn't yet used. For the first time in months, I felt a spark of satisfaction. The tide was about to turn, and Karen, along with the complicit HOA members, had no idea it was coming. I spent weeks planning the buoy installation, mapping out every detail on graph paper, measuring distances with a precision that bordered on obsession. Each buoy had to be positioned to comply with county regulations, marking the legal navigation path while ensuring no interference with my dock or other compliant structures. I revisited the old survey multiple times, overlaying it with current satellite images and GPS readings, confirming that every coordinate aligned perfectly. The legal compliance wasn't optional. I knew that even a minor misplacement could give Karen or the HOA an opening to claim harassment or obstruction. Every bolt, every rope, every reflective marker had to meet state standards, documented with photographs, timestamps, and notes. I spent mornings walking the shoreline, testing depths, noting the angle of sunlight across the water, and calculating the best approach for anchoring the buoys without disturbing the fragile ecosystem I had worked so hard to protect. The sand was soft and cool underfoot, occasionally giving way and leaving traces that would quickly vanish under the gentle lapping of waves. I paid attention to these small details because they mattered. Every anchoring point had to be stable, yet subtle enough not to appear aggressive. The lake itself became a partner in my planning, its currents, ripples, and wind patterns informing each placement. Nights were dedicated to assembling the buoys and their anchors. I worked quietly under the glow of a lantern, the air heavy with the scent of wet earth and algae. Each piece of equipment had to be checked and double-checked, ropes coiled meticulously, hardware polished and aligned. I kept the lights low, the movements deliberate, knowing that any sound might carry across the water and alert Karen or her friends. Every clang of metal echoed faintly against the stillness, each splash against the dock amplified in the quiet night. It felt like a heist, except the stakes weren't money. They were control, justice, and the preservation of boundaries that had been repeatedly violated. The tension was almost tangible. I moved slowly along the shore, dragging anchors behind me, feeling the uneven ground beneath my boots, aware of every snapping twig and distant rustle. The moon reflected across the water, turning the lake into a sheet of liquid silver, masking shadows and creating pockets of light that danced across my work area. I paused often, listening to the night. Frogs croaking, wind through reeds, the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface. The silence between these sounds was deafening, filled with anticipation, as if the lake itself was holding its breath. Each buoy went into the water with careful ceremony. I lowered them from the dock with ropes taut, ensuring they stayed vertical and correctly spaced. I photographed every step, taking note of GPS coordinates, water depth, and anchor positions. My notebook filled with diagrams, measurements, and timestamps, a meticulous record that could withstand any legal challenge. The process was exhausting. Hands raw from rope burns, back aching from bending over, eyes strained from squinting in the dim light. But I didn't stop. Every detail mattered because the moment of confrontation had to be indisputable. By the third night, the layout was complete. From a distance, the buoys looked innocuous, even decorative, but their placement formed a precise channel, redirecting passage away from my dock and directly toward the area Karen habitually used. I walked the length of the shoreline one last time, boots sinking into soft sand, water lapping at my ankles, verifying the path and imagining the first time she would encounter it. I imagined her surprise, the momentary confusion as she realized the route she had taken for months was no longer available. The anticipation was electric, a mixture of satisfaction and nervous tension that set my heart racing. Documentation was as critical as placement. I photographed each buoy from multiple angles, recorded GPS coordinates, and created a map overlay comparing the original survey with the new layout. I also noted environmental conditions, wind direction, current flow, water depth, to demonstrate that the installation was safe and fully compliant with local regulations. Everything was accounted for, legal, practical, and strategic. This wasn't just an act of defense. It was a calculated preemptive strike that leveraged every piece of knowledge I had gathered during the months of harassment. The final night, I stood on the dock, the buoys glinting faintly under the moonlight, ropes taut and secure. The air smelled damp, metallic, alive with the sounds of nocturnal wildlife. I could hear frogs croaking, distant owls calling, and the occasional splash of fish. The lake was quiet, yet the silence was charged with anticipation. I imagined Karen's first approach, the engine roaring as she navigated blindly into the redirected path. The thought sent a rush of adrenaline through me. This was the moment all my planning, research, and patience would finally intersect. As I packed away the last of the equipment, I took one final sweeping glance over the shoreline. Every anchor, every buoy, every note in my notebook was a piece of a larger strategy. The groundwork was laid, and soon the lake would demonstrate that knowledge, preparation, and patience outweigh arrogance, entitlement, and unchecked aggression. The night was still, but I could feel the coming confrontation in every ripple of water and whisper of wind, and for the first time in months, I allowed myself a small, cautious smile. The day came when all the research, all the documentation, all the late-night observations began to coalesce into something tangible. I had spent months cataloging finds, photographing drones, recording suspicious activity, and cross-referencing every HOA communication with county ordinances. Each piece was a puzzle, and now, finally, the image was clear. Karen's daily excursions across the lake weren't just reckless, they were illegal. The original 1924 Shoreline survey, combined with modern GPS measurements and photographs of the redirected buoys, provided indisputable evidence. Every route she had taken violated established navigation paths, and every time she ignored my dock boundaries, she left a record. I invited a few neighbors over, those who had quietly expressed frustration at Karen's antics, but had been too intimidated to act. As they examined the evidence, their expressions shifted from curiosity to disbelief. The emails they had seen, the complaints they had heard at HOA meetings, suddenly revealed themselves for what they were: coordinated misinformation designed to protect Karen and undermine me. For the first time, they saw the pattern of harassment, the repeated misuse of HOA authority, and the legal weight that I had quietly amassed. They weren't just witnesses, they were allies now, ready to support the truth openly. Standing on the dock, I addressed Karen directly, who had just pulled up in her usual swagger, jet ski slicing through the water as if the lake belonged to her. I didn't yell or flail. I didn't need to. I held up a folder containing decades of surveys, photographs, and official ordinances. My voice was calm, precise, and unyielding. "Your route is now illegal," I said, letting the words hang over the water like a gavel striking down a sentence. Her grin faltered just slightly as she glimpsed the organized proof I had compiled. The neighbors' presence amplified the impact. They murmured their recognition of the facts, some nodding, others whispering reminders of previous incidents they had observed but felt powerless to confront. The HOA board members, who had been lurking nearby, shifted uncomfortably when confronted with irrefutable documentation. They could no longer claim ignorance. Every loophole I had uncovered, every ordinance I had cited, every surveillance record I had captured was visible, undeniable. The imbalance of power that Karen and the board had exploited for months was beginning to collapse. As Karen glanced nervously at the folder, then at the buoyed path of the lake, I realized the transformation was complete. I had turned every minor annoyance, every harassment tactic, every falsified accusation into leverage. The late nights, sleepless vigilance, and painstaking research were no longer burdens. They were the instruments of accountability. In that moment, it wasn't just about me or my dock anymore. It was about asserting boundaries, enforcing the law, and proving that patience, preparation, and knowledge outweigh arrogance and entitlement. The morning of the confrontation, the air felt unusually crisp, the lake's surface still and reflective as if holding its breath. I arrived early, carrying folders stacked with every document, photograph, and note I had meticulously compiled over months. The venue was the HOA meeting hall, a modest room with fluorescent lighting, folding chairs, and walls lined with faded community notices. I could already feel the tension, the mixture of curiosity and apprehension from neighbors gathering, whispering among themselves about what had brought me here. Karen, of course, arrived late, as if her presence alone could command the space. Her smug smile didn't waver, but there was a subtle edge in her movements, slightly too stiff, slightly too measured, a tension I hadn't noticed before. The meeting began with the usual procedural notes, the board reading through agendas and minor reports. I remained silent, waiting for the right moment. When the floor opened for property disputes, I stood and laid my materials on the long table at the front. The board shuffled uneasily as I began presenting the facts, my voice calm but deliberate. Over the past 6 months, I said, I have documented repeated violations of local navigation laws and property boundaries. Each instance has been logged, photographed, and cross-referenced with county surveys and ordinances. I flipped through pages of maps, photos of buoys, emails, and HOA correspondence. The behavior of certain individuals, notably Karen, has not only disregarded private property, but has been facilitated by neglect or inaction from the HOA. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the room. Karen's grin faltered, replaced by a thin line of tension. I could see her trying to maintain composure, but her eyes darted nervously toward the photos, showing her repeated passes across restricted paths. Her friends fidgeted, unable to offer support against the mounting evidence. I paused for effect, letting the details sink in. Annotated diagrams, GPS coordinates, and the original 1924 survey proving the legality of my dock and the restricted waterway zone she had violated. Then came the witness testimonies. Neighbors I had quietly allied with stood one by one, recounting their observations. I've seen her zip across the cove multiple times, one said, voice firm. She ignored the wake warnings and splashed several docks, including Moobies, who has every right to protect their property. Another added, the HOA has been aware but hasn't enforced the rules fairly. We've been silent because we didn't know how to challenge her. Their words gave context, emotional weight, and credibility. They weren't just supporting me, they were corroborating a pattern of harassment that had been evident to anyone paying attention. Karen finally spoke, her voice sharp but slightly defensive. I didn't realize, she began, then faltered as the room collectively turned to the documents and photos laid out before her. Her usual smugness had vanished. She was forced into reaction rather than performance. The board members exchanged uneasy glances, realizing the liability they now faced for previous inaction. The weight of the compiled evidence left no room for claims of ignorance. The final blow came when I pointed to the GPS overlay showing her usual route redirected by the newly installed buoys. These buoys, I explained, are fully compliant with county and state law, clearly marking the legal navigation path. Your habitual route, I said, locking eyes with her, violates both local waterway regulations and private property rights. Enforcement action is justified. The combination of visual proof, official documentation, and witness testimony left the room silent but charged. Karen's face reddened, and her friends averted their gaze. The audience, including skeptical neighbors, now understood the full scope of her actions and the HOA's failure to intervene. By the time I finished, the power dynamic had shifted completely. Karen, once untouchable, was publicly embarrassed. The evidence was indisputable, and the community had witnessed the truth firsthand. I gathered my folders slowly, letting the moment resonate, knowing that patience, preparation, and adherence to the law had transformed frustration into undeniable authority. For the first time in months, I felt the tension ease, the scales tipping firmly in my favor. Karen's grin had been her armor for months, but it cracked the moment the full weight of evidence landed on the table. The maps, the GPS logs, the buoys, and the testimonies, all of it stripped away the carefully curated image she had projected. Her usual smirk faltered, then disappeared entirely, replaced by an almost imperceptible tightness around her jaw. The room, once tense with anticipation, now radiated a sense of inevitability. The arrogance that had fueled her repeated trespasses was no match for the meticulous preparation and legal clarity I had amassed. The HOA board, suddenly conscious of their negligence, issued official reprimands in real time. Fines were acknowledged and adjusted, procedural steps were documented, and notices of required compliance were prepared to be delivered immediately. Karen's habitual route past my dock was officially declared illegal. Socially, her influence dissolved in front of the neighbors who had once feared her boldness. Whispers of doubt spread as she slumped slightly in her chair, the facade of control slipping with every witness recounting her behavior. Authority, once wielded recklessly, was now in my hands, precise and measured. The moment of the first jet ski reroute was cinematic in its simplicity. I watched from the dock as Karen approached the lake, engine revving, only to meet the buoyed path I had installed. She hesitated, spinning the handlebars slightly, and realized that the channel redirected her trajectory along the legally designated route. The water sparkled under the afternoon sun, every ripple reflecting the shift in control. Her friends muttered, engine slowing as the new boundaries forced compliance effortlessly. What had once been chaos, the reckless sprays, the splashes, the constant intrusion, now became ordered and visible, law and preparation enforcing safety and property rights without a single confrontation. I felt the rush of moral victory, a satisfaction deeper than anger or revenge. This wasn't just about legal compliance. It was about asserting fairness, reclaiming peace, and demonstrating that knowledge and patience can counter arrogance. I walked the dock slowly, feeling the texture of weathered planks beneath my boots, the faint scent of algae and treated wood mingling with the fresh lake breeze. Every buoy bobbed gently, each one a marker not just of waterway boundaries, but of diligence and strategy. The shift in the lake's energy was palpable. The usual chaos of jet skis and blaring engines had diminished. Traffic followed the new path, moving predictably and safely, and the echoes of past harassment faded against the quiet ripples. Neighbors who had once watched silently now exchanged nods, a subtle acknowledgement of the order restored. Karen's defiance, once untouchable, had been neutralized not with confrontation, but with methodical preparation and legal leverage. The power flip was complete. The lake was no longer a theater for her entitlement. It was a testament to careful planning, patience, and unwavering commitment to property rights. The consequences hit faster than I anticipated, and with a force that left no room for doubt. Karen's repeated violations triggered official fines, each one precisely calculated and fully enforceable under county ordinances. Notices were delivered personally, leaving no opportunity for delay or misinterpretation. The once untouchable figure who had roared past my dock with impunity was now confronted with concrete financial penalties, each dollar a tangible acknowledgement of the disruption and danger she had caused. Beyond the monetary impact, the fines carried legal weight. Repeated noncompliance could result in further restrictions or even confiscation of watercraft access within the protected channel. Public humiliation accompanied the legal repercussions. The community, who had watched silently for months, now witnessed Karen forced to navigate the lake along the officially marked route. Her usual swagger vanished. Friends who had once cheered her antics now murmured in discomfort as she complied with the buoys and official guidelines. Every engine rev, every splash, was a reminder that her entitlement no longer dictated the rules. Even minor deviations were immediately visible to neighbors, documented in photographs and witness accounts. Her reputation, carefully cultivated over years, had eroded in a matter of weeks. The HOA, caught in the glare of their own negligence, issued formal reprimands to the board members who had allowed the harassment to continue unchecked. Several members resigned quietly, unwilling to bear the scrutiny or shoulder the legal implications of inaction. Others shifted their stance, recognizing that previous loyalties and biases had blinded them to the clear violations taking place. I attended a follow-up meeting, observing the subtle changes in demeanor. Once defensive board members now nodded in acknowledgement, their language more measured, their tone less authoritative. The organization that had once wielded power over property owners arbitrarily now had to operate transparently, aware that every action would be scrutinized by both law and community. Karen herself became a cautionary example. Discussions at neighborhood events and online forums referenced her fines, her restricted lake access, and the clarity of the legal precedent now set. Even casual conversations among residents carried a new undertone. Entitlement had consequences. The lake, once dominated by her bold antics, had been restored to order. Neighbors who had hesitated to speak up previously now shared their observations freely, recounting her reckless behavior and applauding the measured, lawful response that had enforced accountability without confrontation. For the first time in months, the water near my dock was calm. The ripples reflected sunlight instead of chaos, and every buoy bobbing gently in the current symbolized not just a physical boundary, but the enforcement of fairness, law, and personal rights. Karen had been stopped, the HOA corrected, and the community reminded that rules applied to everyone, no matter how loud, assertive, or seemingly untouchable they believed themselves to be. The lake felt different the morning after Karen's first rerouted pass. The water was calm, glassy under the rising sun, reflecting the reeds and distant tree line without disruption. The usual tension that had lingered in the air, the sharp vibrations of engines cutting too close, the splash of rogue wakes, was gone. Instead, a gentle rhythm returned, the soft lapping of water against my dock, the hum of dragonflies above the surface, and the distant calls of geese resuming their early flight. The quiet wasn't just natural, it was a sign that boundaries were respected, that preparation and law had created order where chaos had once dominated. Neighbors emerged from their homes, some pausing on the shoreline to wave, others walking across the dock area with smiles that had been rare in previous months. Conversations felt lighter, untainted by suspicion or fear. People shared small anecdotes about the lake, jokes about past incidents, and renewed interest in community events that had been overshadowed by tension and intimidation. I watched as friendships, frayed by gossip and doubt, began to mend. It was subtle at first, a nod here, a laugh there, but the collective change was palpable. The HOA, now operating with greater transparency and accountability, encouraged neighborly cooperation rather than judgment, reinforcing a sense of fairness and trust that had been absent for far too long. My own property, the dock I had built and maintained with painstaking care, felt secure for the first time in months. Walking along the planks, I noticed how the wood no longer bore the anxious tension of looming trespasses, how every cleat, bolt, and railing remained exactly where I intended. The pier, once a focal point of harassment and legal battles, had become a symbol of diligence and rightful ownership. I ran my hands along the weathered surface, inhaling the faint scent of treated wood mingling with lake mist, and felt a deep sense of accomplishment and relief. Even the lake traffic settled into an ordered flow, each watercraft following the legal channels marked by the buoys. The mornings that had once been fractured by noise and disruption were again mine to enjoy. Quiet coffee on the dock, fishing lines drifting lazily into the current, and long moments of reflection on the water's surface. The restoration of calm was more than physical. It was emotional, communal, and enduring. After months of tension, sleepless nights, and relentless harassment, the lake finally belonged to everyone as it was meant to, with rules respected and boundaries enforced. I stood on the dock one last time as the sun began its slow descent, the lake painted in shades of gold and crimson. The morning chaos, the engines roaring past, the spray and disruption, all of it felt like a distant memory now. Months of frustration, sleepless nights, and meticulous planning had brought me here, to a quiet that was hard-earned and deeply satisfying. I realized then that patience and knowledge had been my strongest allies. Every note, photograph, and survey I had collected was more than evidence. It was proof that calm, deliberate action outweighs reckless aggression. The victory wasn't just personal, it was communal. The neighbors, once wary and divided, now walked the shoreline with renewed trust, greeting each other openly and sharing the lake's beauty without fear of disruption. The HOA, humbled and held accountable, had shifted from a source of intimidation to a vehicle for fairness. What I had achieved wasn't a fleeting triumph, it was a precedent, a demonstration that rules exist not to control, but to protect, and that they must be enforced equitably. As I leaned against the railing, feeling the weathered wood under my hands and the cool breeze on my face, I understood that justice isn't always immediate or dramatic. Sometimes it's slow, quiet, and cumulative, built from patience, preparation, and unwavering adherence to principle. I had become more than a property owner defending a dock. I had become an advocate for community rights, a reminder that entitlement and arrogance have limits. The lake reflected the fading light, calm and steady, a mirror to the sense of clarity I felt within. I smiled softly, knowing that the journey had taught me more than law or strategy. It had taught me the strength of measured persistence, the power of knowledge, and the lasting impact of standing up for what is right. This victory was more than mine. It belonged to the community, to anyone who has ever fought for fairness, and to the quiet satisfaction of justice well served. The lake was calm, its surface glassy under the morning sun. Buoys bobbed gently, glinting with a soft sparkle as they traced the new lawful channels. Watercraft moved in orderly lines, engines whispering instead of roaring, splashes muted and predictable. The familiar tension that had shadowed this shoreline for months had vanished, replaced by a sense of peace and balance. I stood on the dock, taking in the gentle sway of the pier beneath my feet, the faint scent of lake water and damp wood filling the air. Neighbors waved from across the shore, faces relaxed and smiling, their trust restored. The community was no longer fractured, the rules were clear and boundaries respected. If you've ever faced a similar HOA nightmare, share your story in the comments below. Lessons learned, victories earned, and boundaries enforced, they belong to all of us.